Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat class. What would normally be our Parashat class, and this week is Parashat Va'et Hanan. However, being that today is a special day, of course, tomorrow is Shabbat Nahamu as well, but today is a special day in that on the calendar is the 15th day of the month of Av, known as the day of Tu, as in 15, Be'av, Tu Be'av. Why is it a special day? We know there's an explicit Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit. And before we read it, I believe that when we go through the sources that we have today, we'll find not only a connection between Tu B'Av and Sh'a B'Av, but we'll see an appropriate theme that connects the two and all the sources together related to Tu B'Av as well. So let's see how that's going to work. The Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit, and I apologize to those on Zoom, we have a source sheet here, and in source number 1, it's well-known, it's the last Mishnah in the Masechet, chapter 4 of Ta'anit, that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael kem 15 be'av yom kippurim. It's a famous Mishnah. Happiest days in the history of Am Yisrael were the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur of all days, right? We're used to crying and fasting on that day. Why? Because on that day, many girls got engaged, and the young girls, unmarried girls, would go out to the fields, go out to the public areas, dressed up, and find possibly their mates. Now, Yom Kippur, although it's an intense day, it's also joyous because it's a day of Kaparas Bihav, atonement. Why is Tu B'Av, an auspicious day, designated for the purpose of introducing and engaging and setting up marriages in Am Yisrael? What a opportunity that was taken, and has to be some type of historical significance, therefore, to the day of Tu B'Av. And the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit on that Mishnah goes through no less than 6 different historical events that took place on Tu B'Av. They may seem a little disjointed and not connected as we go through them, but afterwards, at the end, perhaps we'll connect some of them. Let's go through them quickly. They're not on our source sheet. So one of them, the Gemara tells us that Hutru Shevatim Labo Zeh Bazeh. Tribes, as you know from Parashat Mas'eh, there were to be inheritance from daughters for someone who didn't have sons. Those daughters were not allowed to intermarry, so to speak, marry cross lines of tribes, cross the boundary line, and marry someone from another tribe. Why? Because then, eventually, their husband would inherit, and children would inherit them, and then all of a sudden, land from woman A, which used to belong to her father, would be transferred to man B, which is from tribe B, and one tribe would expand, the other tribe would shrink. So Torah law said, do not intermarry, so to speak, if you're in that situation in life. However, Hachamim of a certain generation derived and learned from the Pasuk that was only relevant to Benot Zelofhad, the daughters of Zelofhad, who came with a certain contention when they didn't have inheritance from their father, and that's how this law was born, but not in a generation afterwards. At some point in time, the Beit Din allowed for this tribal intermarriage, so to speak. Event number 2, Shevet Binyamin was permitted to enter the congregation of Am Yisrael. If you look at the end of the book of Shoftim, there was a terrible debacle called Pelegesh B'Giv'ah. It was an ugly scene, which I won't go into right now. And Shevet Binyamin sinned as a whole, as a tribe. Because of that, a lot of them were murdered because Am Yisrael, directed by God, went against them. And then Am Yisrael, the other tribes, 11 tribes, took upon themselves, we will not allow people of Binyamin as part of Am Yisrael. They're going to completely be, almost as if they're someone of ill lineage, ill-conceived lineage, like a mamzed, God forbid, and they're going to be banned from the rest of Am Yisrael. Eventually, at a certain point in time, they were allowed to enter back in as a normative tribe and interact with Am Yisrael. Event number 3, we know that over the course of 39 years, Am Yisrael, because of the sin of the spies, those who were 20 and above at that time died in the desert. Every Sha'ah B'Av, because that's when it occurred, a number of thousand Jews would die. They just, the Hesed of Hashem, they didn't die through plague or something ugly. They lied down, they didn't get up that morning. One year, this was the 40th year, everyone got up. They said, well, maybe we misread the calendar day, so like, we couldn't see the moon, it was cloudy. So they waited till the 15th of Ab, when it was a full moon, obviously, and they didn't get that wrong, right? They went to sleep and they all got up, and therefore they saw that the decree of death was over, a very joyous day. And that's the third thing that happened historically on Tu B'Av. Number 4, there was a king in the kings of Israel called Hoshea ben Elah. So we know that the kings of Israel were a series of evil men, quite frankly, starting with Yerovam ben Nevat, who was Rasha, and he didn't want the members of his kingdom, which were 10 tribes, to travel pilgrimage to Yerushalayim on the holidays and sort of lose his audience, so to speak. So he made his own temple in Shomron, 2 large calves, right? And there offered sacrifices as well. This went on for centuries. And he also, to prevent anyone from losing his audience, to prevent anyone from doing anything, so to speak, sneaky and leaving and going have pilgrimage to Yerushalayim. Anyway, he would have watch booths on the road to guard them and not let them go to Jerusalem. For centuries, the people, the tribes of 10 tribes were not allowed to go on pilgrimage to Yerushalayim on the holidays. And at one point in time, Hoshea ben Elah was not really a righteous king in his own right. However, he did do a righteous thing and stopped those watch booths. And he removed the guard system and allowed them, whoever wanted from the 10 tribes, to go and make Aliyah Larega on the holidays. Event number 5, the terrible event in the Bar Kokhba revolution, when that was suppressed by the Romans, and the last stronghold, which was the great city of Betar, fell. And in a matter of days, a few 100,000 possible Jews died. There was no one to bury them. It was a tragedy on top of a tragedy. Miraculously, they were able to be buried. Happened on Tu B'Av. That's why we added the 4th Berachat B'Kat Hamazon, Hatov HaMetiv. And finally, the 6th event that occurred on the 15th day of Ab, as told by the Gemara, is that that's the day that, because of the weather and trees became more moist, they stopped in general that year donating different wood, Asiyah Maracha, to the Beit HaMikdash, in order to use firewood for the altar. And so that was sort of the end of a mitzvah. End of a mitzvah, you make a siyum. They made a siyum, right, on that every day, annually, Tu B'Av. So 6 wonderful reasons, and therefore it is an auspicious day to choose to do what the Mishnah said, have people attempt to get engaged and lead to marriage on this wonderful day. What I wanted to look at quickly, now look back at source 1. They went out to the fields, the girls, on Tu B'Av, and it says they went out b'chlei lavan, in white clothing, she'ulin, borrowed. Why? It's there highlighted in blue. Shelo levayesh mi she'en lo, not to embarrass someone who doesn't have. Now, I want you to try to expound upon, just picture the scene, elaborate on that in your mind if you can. Think of not just a woman who cares about how she looks and how she's dressed, but a woman who's going in public, but a girl who is essentially possibly going to meet their hatan, their groom to be. And think about it, we say decked out, and how elaborate and presentable and beautiful that day. She's going to buy the most expensive, wonderful, very substantive, beautiful, expensive gown possible on that day. And it's, imagine nowadays, engagement parties, etc., right? And it's on that day that the Hachamim said, you are going out, not only in something that's not so ostentatious and gaudy, you're going to have to borrow it from somebody else. Used goods, borrowed, and no frills, white only. Borrowed white dress uniform. Can you imagine that? Can we get this generation to do that, please? But look how sensitive Hakamim were to standards, to keeping a lid on standards, to some degree of uniformity, and not putting people who are less fortunate and can't afford in an uncomfortable and embarrassing position. The degree of sensitivity Hakamim are teaching us over here, that we in our society should be super and hypersensitive too. Imagine that. This applies to every community, every society, every age. So Hachamim did that. So what I wanted to find throughout Shas, we find other examples in Halakha where Hachamim were concerned about not embarrassing and not making other people uncomfortable, and therefore impacted halachic directives. So here we go. Three other sources. Masechet Pesachim says in a Beraita, we know that if a Korban Pesach became entirely or partially tameh, it can't be eaten, and it would have to be, sometimes it could, depending, can be brought as a korban shilamim if it's ineligible, but if it's really tameh, it has to be burned. So the Mishnah directed, in that case, you have to bring it to in front of the bira, which is the confines of the Bet HaMikdash, and burn it with the asiyah me'araka, with some of the designated holy wood, so to speak. So there in Pesachim, in source 2, the Beraita says, if someone wanted to burn it in a private area, but with the holy wood, you don't allow it. If he did go to the designated place in the confines of the Bet HaMikdash, but with his own private wood, also you don't allow him. So in other words, it has to be a combination of the right place with the right wood, and it can't be lacking either one of the two. The Gemara says, and I'll paraphrase the next line, okay, I understand why to go in private with the holy wood, that would be problematic, because you might end up using the holy wood for a mundane purpose if you bring it to your own private area. So that I got. But what's the problem with going to the confines of the Temple Mount, and using your own private wood? It's not a korban, it's something that's tameh. And the answer given is that lo amar Rav Yosef lo lebayesh et mi she'en lo, not to embarrass someone who doesn't have and can't afford to contribute their own substantial wood in order to burn this korban pesach that's tameh. So there you have it. Hachamim once again came to the rescue and said that we are sensitive to someone who can't afford even wood for consuming a korban tameh to that extent, and therefore made you use the wood. Imagine that, consume the sanctified wood of the Bet HaMikdash just in order not to embarrass someone who doesn't have their own private contribution. Source 3 from Masechet Moed Katan. It says regarding the laws of mourning and burying a deceased. Says as a Beraita, when they used to at first bring food, Sa'udat Havra'ah, the first Sa'udah, or other meals to the house of the mourner, Ashirin, Bekaltot Shel Kesef Zahav, the rich people to honor the mourners used to bring in baskets of gold. Aniyim, the less fortunate people, they brought food, but in wicker baskets. People were embarrassed to visit the, to console the mourners because they weren't as presentable as other people were. Hachamim made a takana. Everyone's going to have to bring wicker baskets now. I don't care how wealthy you are. You'll never be able to serve and give condolences in a house of mourning and offer your food if you bring anything above a certain standard of even the presentability of a vessel that's holding the food to that extent. Furthermore, go down to the third line. In the beginning, it says, they used to, when they brought out the deceased for burial, they used to bring in those who were more wealthy, the families could afford it, in a more presentable type of coffin, so to speak. And the Aniyim, unfortunately, they couldn't afford something that is less presentable. The Aniyim, with people that were not as financially affluent, would be embarrassed and feel uncomfortable. So Hakamim instituted to make everyone even once again. And finally, it says that in the beginning, actually burying the deceased was more painful to the family than the actual death. Why? Because when someone who couldn't afford had to bury the deceased in some type of not only coffin, but wrappings that were not of silk and cedar wood, etc., on the day of trying to honor their family member, the deceased family member, they felt so embarrassed and ashamed that for all to see that they weren't at a certain level of affluence. Hachamim, so what the Rabbi Gamliel, the Nasi, who was wealthy himself, Nahak Halut Rosh, he lowered himself. When he was died, he asked to be wrapped in meager flax linen sheets only, and that caught on, and that became the law until today. Even the last parting hours of a person's life, make sure, be sensitive, make sure that they are not ashamed and embarrassed. Never to have a family in Am Yisrael not feel comfortable around other people in public. And finally, source 4. The Mishnah says when you marry someone, you have right to ketubah, you pledge to your wife, she never married before, 20 zuz, that's an amount you write to the ketubah. I'm not 20, 200 zuz, 200 maneh, sorry, you write to the ketubah. The question is, can you add if you want? The answer is yes. Go Tosefet ketubah, add whatever you want. We customarily add a certain amount. People were able to add astronomically if they wanted to. Now the Gemara asks on that Peshita, why shouldn't you be able to add for the sake of your wife? Should you ever be divorced or deceased, she has the benefit of that money. And the answer is, because you would have thought that Hachamim would put a cap on it, not to embarrass others. And the answer is no. Why no? Only for one particular reason. Because money in a ketubah is a deterrent also for someone, at least it used to be, to divorce his wife. And so therefore, we want to keep that deterrent in place. But the lesson we learn from here, if not for the reason of that deterrent, then indeed, Hakamim would have put a cap even on monies dedicated to a woman's ketubah, so as not to shame somebody else who gets married and couldn't afford to join this trend of writing in $200,000, $500,000 to a ketubah. I want you to reflect upon these sources for a moment and look that there's a certain type of graduating hierarchy where on one hand, in a social scene when they got married, because that you can understand, Hachamim wanted to control the standard of the engagement dresses, so to speak. But regarding burning the Korban Pesach, something that's more a holy activity, you would think that's not so bad to invest. Even that, they put a lid on it. Now you might think, okay, there you're not really performing an active mitzvah, you're just getting rid. It is a mitzvah, but it's not something that you have to do. It's circumstantial. It becomes impure. You have to burn it. But in terms of making the mitzvah of Nihum Avidim, consoling the mourners, and it's a hesed as well. Well, there you might say that Hachamim let you go all out. No, even there, they had a control and a limit to the sensitivity and not embarrassment of your fellow man. And then finally, in the ketubah case, which they would have enacted it, you would think certainly there, for the sake of supporting your wife, even then, they thought to and could have and would have also made limitations in order not to embarrass. The lengths that Hachamim went to in order to be sensitive to another person and make sure that Am Yisrael all felt comfortable and not embarrassed. Now, if you reflect back on some of the events that took place on Tu B'Av, there are some of them very inclusive events. Shevet Binyamin was allowed to rejoin the congregation of Am Yisrael. Women who were from a father that only had daughters and then got, inherited land, eventually were able to intermarry cross boundaries of the tribes, including them in the other tribes, inclusiveness. And then, of course, the historical event of allowing people from the kingdom of Israel to make pilgrimage on the regalim, on the 3 holidays, and join their brethren from the kingdom of Yehudah on the holidays. So really 3 of the 6 events on this joyous 15th day of the month of Av are about unity, are about inclusion, and so much therefore partner beautifully with the concept of sensitivity towards Am Yisrael and laws enacted in order to make sure that Am Yisrael is comfortable. How appropriate, therefore, is the celebration of Tu B'Av, some of the historical events that occurred on it, and then many of the laws as an extension of one of those events, not to embarrass the other. How appropriate is that after Tisha B'Av, which we mourn the lack of unity and the lack of inclusion? And how much, therefore, is Tu B'Av, so to speak, a tikkun, a correction, and an encouragement post Tisha B'Av to do the right thing and get Am Yisrael back on their feet in terms of including everyone and unifying our nation and making sure that we are super sensitive and caring about every member of Am Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom and happy Tu B'Av.